right. So before we do anything new, I wanted to ask, I saw that not everybody, but a good chunk of people took the quiz. If you haven't had a chance to take the quizzes, I'd definitely love to see your responses. You know, I haven't been doing a great job of this in the past, but these are really sort of gauge where people are at and see how they're doing. Did anybody want to go over any of the questions that were on the quiz, like more clarification on anything? Looked like people did really, really well on the first one for sure. And then the second one, there was a little bit more trouble across the board.
Okay, I don't know this.
Right.
Try to do my research and try to find something.
I can never get to the slides either.
Yes, how you post that. Let me, probably won't get to it tonight, maybe tomorrow. I mean, try and get some of that straightened out. If not, maybe Daisy can help out there. I don't know all the details of that site, so. So we can go through the questions real fast, just on the second one, just to make sure we're all on the same page.
First one was like, oh, yeah.
Which of these is not valid JSX? Yeah, it's a little bit of a tricky one. Do people know what the answer is on this one? The last one? Can you say why? Yeah, yep. It's because everything needs a, I should go into the normal quiz variant of this instead. But yeah, everything needs to be closed in JSX. So that either means that you have to, this used to have like a pointer. I think the battery died on it ages ago.
Point on your face.
Yeah.
Point on my face.
Yeah.
It's way too dim.
It only works on your
Yeah.
face.
So this has a closing tag, and this is self-closing. Even this H1 is self-closing. This has no closing tag. And that's different than HTML. So people who are familiar with HTML, that's one difference where you wouldn't be used to always having to close every tag. If anyone, go back in time for a minute. So HTML has been through a lot of iterations. And actually back when there was like HTML 3 or something like that, at that point HTML sort of split. And there was a push for something called XHTML, which would have been XML valid HTML, so valid to parse. And that required this same type of syntax. So if you were writing XHTML, everything had to be validly closing, but it ultimately didn't win as the version of HTML required too many strict rules. But for React JSX, it does require that. Let's talk about this next question. Which of these is the correct way to embed JavaScript into JSX? It's the first one, yeah. And this one's a little tricky because if you're doing template literals inside of JavaScript, it's actually a little different than any of these. Template literals, it's the $ outside of the curly braces. So it's unfortunate that they're not using the exact same format for the two. You know, it'd be nice, but you just have to remember that it's a little different in these different cases. So what tool do we use to translate JSX files into standard JavaScript? We use Babel, and we haven't used it yet in class directly. We've been relying on something behind the scenes to do that translation for us, or I mean, that'll sort of always be the case. You don't use it a lot very directly. You use like a build tool. So that's more one, just sort of knowing the background of how stuff works. So if we have this code below, what is title equals, oh, I'm jumping around here. It's because I'm in like the edit mode variant. Or if I can go into the little eyeball right here. There we go. That's better. Perfect. So yeah, this is just an attribute. And that's really the same name that you have in HTML for that same type of syntax. It's known as an attribute. JSX syntax is the same as HTML and JavaScript files. That's false, but it's very, very similar. It's just not exactly the same. It is a trick question because it's a trick idea, right? There's a distinction, and we're going to see why that matters today much more than what we did so far. Because so far, we've pretty much just been writing HTML elements. Today, we're going to be able to do something different and start to build on some of the more powerful aspects that you have in React. So that leads into, I love that as the last question because it really helps lead into the topic for today, which is dealing with components in React. So far, all we've talked about is the basics of React, doing the rendering, a little bit about the virtual DOM that it has. But the real key, like in my mind, the central element of React when you're really building stuff out are components. So the definition taken straight from the React site for components are components let you split the UI into independent, reusable pieces and think about each piece in isolation. That's where we get this value out of components. Which makes me say, does that sound similar to any JavaScript concepts or tools that we're already familiar with? Like, can you think of a JavaScript functions, right? It sounds similar to functions. Anything else? Classes? That's close. I'm going to say objects. Yeah, same thing, right? So it sounds similar to functions and objects. And the reason is because they're all tools for abstraction. And that's like the key part here, right? I love this quote. The essence of abstractions is preserving information that is relevant in a given context and forgetting information that is irrelevant in that context. So I've talked about this a little bit before, but I want to give a lot more examples, and I want you guys to really think about it. And that's because, to me, abstraction is the key to programming. And learning to think in abstractions is critical to being an effective programmer. Like, this is the most useful tool you can have. So let's talk about, and I'll use some of the same examples I've had before, but let's talk about examples of abstractions that you have in everyday life. Because we have a lot of them, but we don't think about them that way, right? If you are, driving a car down the road, somebody tells you, oh, it's a left turn here, right? Like, that's an abstraction for so much stuff taking place under the covers. So or if they say, oh, to turn left, you just turn the steering wheel, to the left. Like, that's abstracting away everything else that's going on. That steering wheel is connected with a shaft down to a set of gears, and those gears are turning a set of arms that will turn your wheels so that your car actually turns, right? But you don't have to deal with all of it. Going back to there's a lot of information that's irrelevant in that context. It's not stuff that you have to worry about when you're talking about taking a left turn. So it's all important. It's all happening, but you don't want to have to think about that every time you do that. You wouldn't be able to get anywhere if you had to think about everything going on. Oh, I'm pressing the gas pedal, and that's going to put more gas into the engine, which is going to cause more heat when the pistons fire, which is going to cause the engine to turn faster, which is going to make my wheels go faster, right? All of that is an abstraction. Like, pushing the gas pedal is an abstraction for everything going on under the covers when that takes place. And so we deal with this all the time. Like, language is an abstraction, and we're always working on useful terms to contain concepts, right? Like, if I say, I live in a city, that's an abstraction. That implies a lot over saying I live in a town. Or, if we talk about the type of building you live in, you're like, or I work downtown. Downtown is an abstraction around a portion of the town. And so it's the same thing for programming. It's really the reason I'm sort of taking some time away from just diving into React is I think the better you get at learning to abstract away stuff, the better you're going to be at programming. And this becomes real obvious. The reason I, again, went back to functions and objects is because those are tools for allowing you to think that way. So you'll see when we start breaking down problems and I start showing you examples of like working through how to break down different types of problems that we work through, a lot of what I do is going to be based on this concept of abstraction, where I'm not going to try and solve the whole problem at one point in time. Instead, I'm going to just make an abstraction and say, I assume that's going to solve this other problem. I don't really care how it does it. And I'm just going to make some assumptions about that. Such as, writing in your code, like turn the steering wheel left or something. And I assume that that's going to do all this stuff under the covers about what's going to happen in the car. And I'll solve that later. I don't want to have to worry about that. So abstraction and programming, right? I said I think it's critical to it. So examples of it, everything that we do is sort of built on it, right? From the very beginning, we have binary to machine code. That's an abstraction because the computer processes binary, but machine code is this slightly higher level, really, really ugly. Has anybody seen machine code here? No? All right, let me try and. Let me see if I can even find some good examples here. Like it is, yeah, binaries, ones and zeros, but then these are the like instructions that you typically write in at the lowest level. Like this is what the processor converts to binary. And you can see this is a programming language. This is, but it's almost impossible to, I mean, how in the world are you going to be able to read, like, this is a small program? Really hard to understand. And so we have abstractions from that, right? We have machine code to higher level languages. So we've got these languages that are easier to understand and talk about. We've got C, we've got, Fortran. These are old ones. We have got newer ones like JavaScript and Python and Ruby that are much easier to think about. But even then, it's still too hard to think about everything in that language at one time. So you've got this concept of going from a series of statements to a function. So I only have to think about the function, and that lets me hide all of these statements. And a lot of times we go from functions to objects, right? This object handles some state and some functions and some properties, and that way I can think about the object and just working with that. And then levels it, you guys haven't really worked with a lot yet in class. A lot of times you take the set of related objects and you put those into, say, a module or a package. So that's, an example is sort of like the math module in JavaScript, which has a whole bunch of related functions, but there's much bigger ones out there as well. And then you'll take packages and these modules and put them together to create applications, right? So everything is just built on this series of abstractions on abstractions. Focus on getting better at to become a better programmer is learning to think in abstractions and take the details of a problem and sort of hide them and then worry about those separately. And the better you get at learning how to chop things up into these pieces where you can think about them in independent blocks, the better you're going to get in programming. So let's talk about the main abstraction, like the most basic one in React, which are components. And I'm going to introduce the simpler version of components first. So there's really two ways to declare components in React. The most basic one is the function component. A function component is just a function that returns a React element. That's all there is to it. So that's the full definition of it. So we saw what React elements were in class last time. A function component is taking that same idea and just turning it into something where we can get back this React element from a function. So nothing too tricky going on here, right? This is a very, very simple example where what we took was our greetings, our welcome application that we've been working with. And let me get rid of all this real fast. And we just converted it into, I think this site isn't running right. That page isn't running. Hold on. I want you to see that. Let's give it a moment. All right. It looks like I have a problem here. Let me see if I can figure it out. Maybe not.
We have the word element and next to it.
It should be there.
Yeah, I know.
I'm gonna try something here. See if it makes it happy. There we go. All right. So this is really simple. This is pretty much the most basic component you could create for React, right? All it is just returning this element, this very, very simple element. But, and this is again why, getting back to why JSX is not just HTML in JavaScript. Look at what we're doing in this React DOM.render. We're not calling an HTML element here. We wrote this like this was an HTML statement, but it's actually ultimately calling this function, getting back what came from this and rendering it. So let's walk through that in a little more detail, right? This component is invoked using the same JSX syntax we were using before to invoke HTML elements. I'm going to give you, basically there's going to be two rules here that you'll see today. This one is, I'm just sort of inlining it here, and the other one is later on, which is a much stricter rule, but always start component names with a capital letter. You do that because React by default, if it sees any JSX element that has a lowercase letter, it assumes it's an HTML element and not a component. So it creates stuff differently in those different cases. So always start your component names with a capital letter. So let's, I'm gonna take a moment and have you guys, I'll bring that back up as an example once we get this going. But I've got, oops, I don't want to load that on my same page. I want to load that somewhere else. So I've got here, taking the same concept, pretty much the same thing that we had before. Not very different from our fruits example, but as I said, I love to do superhero type stuff. Is a very simple React application that's just rendering a list of heroes here, right? So we're going to be building on this through class today as we keep going. And if I keep going at this speed, we're going to get through this material and I'll probably start moving into some other stuff as well. But what I want you guys to do, we're going to do this as an exercise now, is take this list of heroes that we have. So load up, you know, this Hello World page from CodePen. I can post the link to this again real fast so people can get that really easily if you need it. And then you can cut and paste this other stuff into it. Might be able to post a link to this actually. Let me see if I can post a link directly to this for people to use. Actually, yeah, this will work even better so you guys don't have to copy it over. So you should be able to access that and then start from this same starting point. And then what I want to see, and we'll give a good chunk of time before I work through it, is try and convert this over to using components for each one of these elements. And I'll sort of give you, an example after just a couple minutes if people are stuck. But think about converting it over to using components, very similar to this, instead of having all of the elements, React elements, directly rendered right here, sort of the way it is right now. So imagine, if you will, right, that you have something more like this Superman might look more like Superman like that, and that you have a component that handled the rendering of it. Does that make sense? Yeah. And feel free to ask questions. I will leave this up on the screen so that you guys have a reference.
I have a question.
Yes.
When you pasted this,
Yes.
you copying that it wasn't working, and you type in something.
Yes. What I did is I put curly braces.
Yes, maybe.
Yeah. So let me just a moment. Let me fix this. So hopefully you guys won't have that problem. I don't know what you're talking about. The curly braces were there all along. No, I put curly braces. What that does is that's a way to say this is evaluate this whole thing as a single expression for JavaScript. And so what was going on was it was obviously having a hard time reading this JSX as a single expression before. So by putting curly braces around it, I was just sort of setting it off, saying this is an expression. Evaluate this as one thing. And while I'm sure absolutely nobody cares, just so you know, this is a quote from one of my all-time favorite movies, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. So expect more quotes from it at some point. How are people doing? Anyone done? No? It's feeling very busy worky right now, right? Is anyone stuck? Yeah?
A little bit. Well, I have a question.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can answer this without giving away. So, how having a hard time knowing if I should shove everything into one function, the entire list, and just create them all as like one variable, or if these should be like children and in different functions.
What I would
Does that
say,
make sense?
yeah, I get what you're saying. So what I would recommend is to create separate functions for them right now. And I think it'll highlight, I think by going down that route, you'll get to see the benefit of when we switch over to a different approach. But yeah, I would recommend separate functions. So something like this. And I'm just gonna put some stuff here and then.
I tried what you said, and
So I would
All right.
recommend something like that right now. You know, with ... being the.
I have a question. I did that, but why, like, attribute like the title? What's the, it's just because we're gonna use this for something else, but why title Clarkian, Superman?
Ooh, where did I put the title
Where
attribute?
it shows up on it,
Where does it show up?
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
No.
I'm sure there's some.
It's
title.
nothing too fancy. I just think it's sort of fun. So title actually shows up by default in most browsers as hover text. So it's sort of like the way to see their like secret identity is if you hover over
Oh.
an element, then it pops up. So sort of it's hidden. It's secret. It's a good question. There was a point behind that. It's secret. Oh, we might. We might evolve what we're doing with it later. Because you're feeling like you're writing a whole bunch of the same stuff right now, right? Oh my gosh, I'm writing so many of the same thing. That's okay. I'm having you do that so that you get used to writing components. All right, is anyone done? No?
Page and responsive. Thank you. No. No.
And so for the next one, it might be faster to just start from where this one was anyways. So it might not be worth it to, like if you don't make it through this one or whatever, it might be worth it to just start from this point again. So you can just reload that page. Superman 2, like Superman 2 was a great movie. Oh wait, that's not what you're asking. Sorry. Did anybody? You done? All right. Other people moving on. Does anybody have not, or even one of them not done? Somebody,
I'm doing the same, so
you don't have one done yet? Okay. So let me come talk with you for just a minute and see where we're at.
Page was responsive.
Yeah.
I just figured out how to get this to show. What happened?
I think that we have to.
So I've been trying to figure that out.
Now,
It's like, now I
saying
know.
that we're gonna do that. When we work
Like, I don't know.
with classes.
So we're gonna.
But that's why he's saying we have to write everything super lines.
Sure.
So, okay, so right,
Until the town, yes. Like inside the lines, title, is it strings,
So let's start with really. We're gonna work on function.
numbers,
And he said that
returns.
this function should
Then
start with capital.
You have, this is the opening title, close, then you put Superman up there. And then you go.
Oh, yeah.
Ay, Dios y la Virgen.
Capital S. Yes, right, right.
Después, so yeah, sí, se lo todo el día.
Help you get this one. That's fine. Just on the other side. So then you- Yeah. Now, you can just put it back. Yeah, here I saw it. Space, but it's just be-
It's capitalized cash.
I was putting in.
Look, I'm just doing this function.
Yeah.
Yes.
For example,
Because you have a line, that's when I asked, what is Carol numbers?
All right. Let's work through this together. Yes.
Same question, but I don't know.
Do you have the same question on a different program? Are you guys trying to get advanced? Are you trying to jump ahead? No? Are you stuck on this?
Yeah, but we just have.
All right, let me check real fast.
Copy and paste that.
What's that?
So you have your function.
I had to do that. Every single
Okay.
superhero. Because this is what you see, the title, then you have curly braces, it's saying, the title is not a variable. Which is, devils, so we're gonna find you should have the variable.
Yes, that thing, yeah.
This whole thing. This whole class.
And type in capital.
Everything's those.
So This is like React.
Captain Mode.
Space.
Yeah,
I'm not doing that.
Yeah,
Yes, you need all constructors.
they start with one on the second one.
Oh, I haven't seen it. I'll show you guys.
Great question. That was basically what I would do it on the side of the road. Over here. I
But
did
she says
super
we
good.
need to.
Oh, that would get you this, yes.
I mean, if I said, like, these classes, this verbal synchronicity.
Yeah, so if you want to do more.
Social function. These are
JavaScript.
That's what I was.
like, you see that HD curl figures, and then it goes to the other one, has no eye.
Now,
So it's like for the high time.
each superhero.
Like you would see what it's
I know what
And I'm gonna show you where Superman function
on
these
Just-
Up above transition and then down.
All right, I like this. I like hearing people talk to each other.
See?
So you're gonna have.
That's good.
This new.
That's good.
It's gonna be. Yeah.
It's verbal.
So who thinks they have it, or at least the idea of what we're trying to do here? I've lost the class. So who thinks they have the idea, the concept of what we're doing here, working so far? Maybe? All right, you guys want to see me work through it? Doing the same thing? All right, this is I hope this will be the pattern that we'll use for a lot of stuff where I'm gonna have you guys try and work through problems and then me work through the same problem so you can see sort of that back and forth, like how I would solve it. Now in this case, I gave myself some pretty big constraints, and you'll get to see shortly after this how I would solve it very differently if I was building this out in reality, but we haven't yet talked about the other aspects of components. So given the constraints I have, I've got very limited capability. So I'm going to start with one of these. I'm going to create a Superman component. And then what I'm going to do, it's just a function, and it's just going to return a JSX element. And all of these are just these sort of list item things. Now I'm going to get a little lazy here. I'm not going to put the rest of the stuff in here. I'm going to leave it sort of incomplete for a moment.
Before you do that, I do have a question. For the secret identity, where would that go?
Yes. So there's a lot of different ways to do that. I'm going to, for now, have it almost disappear as a variable, and then you'll see in our next step like how you would handle that a little differently. So this is me being lazy. I just wrote out the core of my function. It'll be pretty much the exact same for all of these, and I'm just going to copy and paste it multiple times. So the first one of these is Superman, and then the title is Clark Kent, and the body is Superman. And just to make sure that this is all working, I'm going to put a block comment here around all these other ones so that they don't interfere with my code. And then I'm going to test replacing this escape JavaScript, this inline JavaScript, with invoking the component for Superman. And we can see that it works the same as before. So all that did, and we'll go through again what's going on behind the scenes. I've got a slide talking about what's happening here. But all I did there was I've got a function that just directly returns this list item with the Superman stuff pretty much hard-coded in there, right? So, yes?
Could we use JSX inside what you have in the return? So for example, create a variable for Clark Kent and then use the curly braces JSX. You see what I'm asking? Inside what you're returning? Where do we use JSX? Like everywhere?
Yeah, all of this is JSX2 actually. We're just not using a variable in it or any escape JavaScript. But yeah, anytime you're embedding anything that looks like HTML, that's JSX really.
That answers my question.
So yes, we can, and I'll show you the more traditional way to work with variables and stuff like that in just like the very next step. So a big chunk of this is sort of rote, like having people do something over and over to get a little bit of practice. There's, a whole theory of programming, and I'm trying to balance it because I find it a little tedious, which is like learn something the hard way, which basically involves typing a whole bunch of code out over and over before you even know what you're doing to try and get the muscle memory in place of what am I writing out, right? Because one of the things that is a big obstacle to people when they're learning programming is getting stuck on syntax, having these things where they just don't quite get it. And the gist of that is to try to almost hammer those basics into you so that they're not as much of an obstacle and you can move on to thinking about problems. Yes?
I did the secret identity out of it. I put for title secret identity for Captain Marvel. But I put it in.
Oh, yeah. We can do that. In fact, no, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I'll do exactly that here, right? Like, there's two ways we could do that since I had the variable already for Captain Marvel, right? We can do, we can put the Captain Marvel bit here. And then for the title, we could directly write in the name. But as you were talking about with variables, this is just escaped. Remember, the curly braces just let you put JavaScript in. And since we already have the secret identity for Captain Marvel up here as a JavaScript variable, we can just put it in here for the title. And now we can change this line of code out and call the Captain Marvel component instead. And we should work just fine. So that let us we can use this variable sitting up here because it's within the scope of these functions because it was declared at the scope of this whole file as opposed to inside of a function. And we can still refer to it in here. Does that make sense? All right, now we just have our other ones. Oops, like I put a space in my function name, which doesn't work. You Wonder Woman. Make sure I spell that right. Did I make too many of these? Looks like I may have. All right, and we can replace these other ones now. What we see when we've done that is we've got the same results as before on our screen, but we've switched over from just writing everything as a direct React expression to using this these components, right? And again, this is the fundamental building block of React, are building things out with components. And what we're seeing here is we're beginning to see the power, right? We've created things that look like HTML elements, but they represent more than an HTML element. They represent more than just a direct like LI. It includes other properties on them, right? Like this includes the body text and this title attribute. And all of that comes back just by requesting this Spider-Man component right there. So there's a lot of it's subtle, but there's a lot going on there that's really powerful. Does that make sense? Does this version of the code make sense? Anybody confused by this? All right.
So
Yes.
I have a question. So when I did this the first time, I was putting the component into where the arrows with curly braces.
Yeah.
At the bottom. Is that?
That's perfectly fine too. No, there's nothing wrong with that. Yeah, you can write it out in multiple different ways. I just inserted them here because that's where they were before. I also did that partially as foreshadowing of where I want to go next, but it's not right or wrong to have put it in the other location either. So you mean like right here you were writing out like
Yeah, put like
the Superman? Yeah, perfectly fine. Perfectly fine. All right, so now we're going to just finish one exercise and we're gonna get close to moving right into the next one, but we're gonna introduce a new concept here for our functional components. And this is where we're gonna start getting more powerful, which is that any JSX attributes defined on an element get passed into the component as a single props object. And I'll explain this in more detail about what's actually going on. But if we look here, I've rewritten this welcome component, and I'm gonna go ahead and take this and put it over in the code over here so it's easier to see what's going on. Look, you see the mistake I made? I escaped my stuff wrong too. I need to go back into my slides and update that. I don't know if you guys just saw that, but I had the $sign in my attempt to escape my stuff. So just so you don't worry about, oh man, we're the only one who makes that mistake. So here's what I've done here. Very, very simple change, but it gives us a lot of power. I took this welcome that we wrote before, or I wrote before, and now it accepts a props property. It has a props attribute on it, right? And now when we call the welcome, when we invoke the component down here, we can pass in attributes, and any attributes that we pass in all become properties on this props component. So that's not completely clear just right off the bat, but basically what's happening is it'll take any attributes and create one object when it calls this welcome component, put all those attributes on that object and pass that in as the first parameter when it calls this function. And so then we have access to this object, which means we have access to any parameter passed in. So now we can add our own custom attributes to something. So I can do welcome Jared and just change it. I can do welcome Daisy. And we can also add in other attributes at a whim. So let's say we're going to have, I don't know, time of day as an attribute. And we'll say morning. So then I can do props.time of day and have access to that. And just sort of, they're all on this props object is what happens for any attribute that we have. Does that make sense so far? We'll work through a lot more with this and I'll give you a better example. So let's walk through that example piece by piece. This is what I was talking about. We're gonna walk through it. There's basically 4 steps that are taking place when we do this, right? The first thing we do is we call React DOM.render with the welcome name equals Cisco element. That's a React element. But what that does is React calls the welcome component function with this object, an object with a property with key name and value Cisco, right? Or in the second case, it'll have 2. It'll have a key name value Cisco and a key of time of day with the value of morning. So it's just creating an object out of all the properties that, or attributes that you pass in. Then the welcome component, which is just that function, in this case, returns an H1, welcome Cisco, I've been expecting you, end H1 element. And if you remember, elements are immutable. So that's why I'm included all of this detail there, like that all together is the element that was returned.
Values. The keys only have one value. Values only have one. So can you have like a list of arrays as the value of, like assign a key to a list of arrays?
Yeah, you could. And you'll see that. In fact, I wasn't planning on doing that, but no, it works well with our example. So I may step through, evolve the bit of code that we've been working on to doing exactly that, to sort of show you how easy some of that is. Yeah, because your keys and values can really be any, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but really any,
So I was thinking categories. I was
Yeah.
thinking of the example we're doing.
Yep.
Yes, okay.
any JavaScript can be your values of your attributes that you pass in. There's just a couple minor rules about how you do it, but other than that, it works just fine. So the last step, okay, so it called react-dom.render with this element, which called the welcome component, passing in the props object, which only has this one property on it, which rendered this element, and then React DOM updates the DOM to match the returned element. Let me see here. Oh, let's skip that for a second. Let's not go there just yet. So does that make sense? It's what's going on there for the most part? Is it's passing any of those props in to your component. And we had, like I said, this one's more, tried to add a second one so you can see a little more going on in it, where we have multiple props. So there's also one that sort of a special property, if you will, because the JSX, this might get a little confusing. We'll definitely see examples. They'll make sense, and you guys will work through it. The JSX contained within a set of JSX tags is also passed to the component as part of the props object. Its key is children. It is the children property of the props object. So now we can change this. And here's a version of this same program where instead of passing in a name like attribute on our component, we just treated our component much more like an HTML element, and we put some content in between the tags, right? Just put that content right there, and that becomes this children property of our component when we get called. So remember that it passes everything in on this props object. Children is just one of the properties on it. And in this case, the children is just this string, Amina, and we're able to access it just like that. That makes sense? So this is really, we're getting to the fundamental pieces of a component here and what we'll use to build stuff out. Now let me make this example a little more complex so you guys can begin to see that it doesn't have to be just a string. Anything that you pass inside of these brackets is the children of it. And so we can make this, let's now pass in, let's do another element. Let's make it italic or I. And so this whole thing is the children property and was injected right here. Right? So it can be any arbitrary bit of JSX in between those tags. That's why that wording was a little weird on that slide where I said the JSX contained within a set of JSX tags. It's not like the string or something like that, because this is just a bit of JSX. And now we could even format it if we want it to look a little prettier, like, and we've got something that's, you know, looking a little more interesting. And maybe we're going to add some other items in here. it doesn't have to be just one thing either. We could add in some other ones if we want. Anything inside of here is part of this children property. Does it make sense?
I'm always afraid to do that, like, you just typed in another children there, and it just, I feel like I'm gonna mess something up, like, I wanna experiment, but I feel like I'm gonna write something and I'm gonna mess something up, and I don't know, like, what went wrong.
You know what the best way to learn how to code in my mind is to make mistakes. Mess it up. Like, you could get me on a huge rant there, right? I think one of my positions, people talk about like, oh, we've got a tech literate generation and all this stuff right now. But I think in order to truly be technically literate, you have to be willing to break your stuff, like try it and have it go wrong, because that's the only way you actually understand how it works. Otherwise, all you learn is like how to follow a safe path through something.
Is there a tool that is better at spinning up feedback? Because that will only say something like,
Right. This doesn't give you much feedback, right? There's a lot of stuff that'll give you better feedback, and we can. Let me take a note of that so that I can try and find you something that'll work well. So there's a lot of stuff. You can also get some feedback from this, and I know you guys haven't worked with this a lot, but the common way to get a lot of this type of feedback when you're having problems is what's known as the dev tools. So those are available. They're really, they take a little while to get used to, but they're really, really powerful. And they exist in Chrome. The easiest way to get to them is like right click or something, and you can click inspect anywhere. And what you bring up is, and we'll probably have, I've given whole talks on this before. Oh yeah, that's right. The power went out during my talk on this, so we don't have a recording of it. DevTools are really powerful. They give you access to everything going on inside of this browser window. So you can see, like if I'm scrolling around here, you can see all these different portions of the page, even though those aren't even the bit that we're looking at. Or if we inspect over here, because this is all inside of an iframe, so it's isolated, you can see what's going on in our bit of page, like what does React actually render on the screen. And also, it'll a lot of times give you errors in this console tab when something's gone wrong. So if I did something like this, I don't know what I'm going to get. No, I don't get much of anything. I get a little warning down here. Unknown unterminated JSX content. So that tried to help me out. But yeah, it's possible to get like this should hopefully give me an error. It looks like a lot of them are showing up down here. But other times you'll see the error show up here in your console when something goes wrong. So like if I saw an error because I told it throw an error, like don't work, give me an error, and it's telling you there was an uncaught error. And I mean, yeah, we'll get better tools, but it's trying to give you some advice about what happened, where this error was. When you're not running inside of CodePen, when we start running our own page, then it'll be a lot easier to see where the error occurred than inside of CodePen. And we'll probably get to that sometime, I don't know, next week. But there's a lot of setup and environment stuff that makes it a little bit of a pain to get working when you're doing your own thing. So I think it's a lot easier to get people started in here and then introduce all that setup and stuff for people later. It's a good question though. Yeah, feel free to break stuff. Plus with CodePen, you can always just, load up another one, refresh it, do whatever. Any other questions right now? Oh, let me get rid of my error. All right. Oh, I already jumped ahead a little bit here, but composing components. So components can refer to other components, right? Now, in this case, we were just sort of embedding it as part of the children, but you can also just refer to them anywhere. And we were just referring directly to HTML, but you can refer to any other component. So this allows for creating multiple levels of, once again, going back to my favorite concept, abstraction through the composition of components. And so here's an example. A little more complex than the ones that we components here. So we actually have two different components in this, and I'll snag all of this and we'll move it over here so that it's easier to see. Oh. I snagged more than I intended. All right, so if we look at what we have going on here in this bit of code, we have, before we get down to this React DOM render bit, and I had it very tightly minified there so it could all fit on the slide. We've got two components. So let's walk up from the render here. We're rendering a movie list component. All right, nothing too fancy there. Here's our movie list. That's very simple. Declared it using a function. It returns an unordered list, but inside of that unordered list, I don't have LIs directly. I have a list of movie components that I'm declaring. So this is composing our components, right? Starting to build something up out of these other building blocks that we've made. All right, so what's a movie component? Well, I've got that right up here, except I wrote this using a different syntax. Does anybody remember what this type of function is called? An arrow function? Great. So I used an arrow function. I really only did this so it all fit on the slide, but I'm probably going to try and switch up some of this syntax bit by bit to get you guys introduced to it so that you'll be comfortable seeing it. But this is not significantly different than this movie list if it took in a props property. So it's a function that's going to take a props property, and then what it returns is this li props dot with the props dot children rendered inside of it, right? But what we're beginning to see here too is, notice we reused this movie component. So we rendered 3 different elements all using the same movie component, right? And now what we've got is an abstraction that lets us change the behavior of all of these items just by changing what our movie component returns. So we could do all sorts of changes if we wanted to without having to change each and every one of them. So if we go back to that idea of let's slap them in an I element, we can do that and we change all 3 of them because they're all just rendering that movie component, right? We didn't have to go through and change it at each one of those points in time. So that's getting back to that idea of the abstraction, the function, the composability of what we're doing here, right? We're composing out of a movie list and movie component. So these 2 components, and then we're building our very simple list here, right? Told you Bill and Ted would make more appearances. This is the list of my 3 favorite movies, by the way. So nice, and they don't really fit in the same genre. Does this make sense? What's going on there? All right, so time to go back to our heroes. And I will pull back up that example I just had so you guys will be able to see that on the screen. But you can either start from where you're at if you have the heroes already converted over to components, or you can go back to the original version, which wasn't using components, it just had those elements. And what I want us to do is now convert the list of heroes. So instead of having a separate component for every different hero, create a single hero component. And that one will create each hero, but also have a hero list component that renders the whole list of the heroes. So if we went, let me see, like this is the state it's at right now. what I'd like to be able to see is instead of like down here, for example, instead of calling this heroes element, I'd like to be able to do something like just go hero list. And that's what that should look like. So then we'll need a hero list component and then a hero component. And we'll get rid of all of these individual hero components.
Can you go back to the instructions? You need the hero and then the hero list.
Yes, a hero and hero list component. If there's any questions, feel free to ask. I'm going to put this code back up here so that you guys have it as a reference because I think it's a good example. It might be leading too much, but I hope not. So that you guys can convert over to reusing a component. And you're going to need to do this by using props in that component. I'll give this maybe 10 minutes or so, unless people finish up faster.
Oh, ya entiendo, ya entiendo.
How are people doing? Anyone done?
I have the
Yeah.
title secret.
Mm-hmm.
We need to put
Yeah. Needs to be an attribute that you pass into your hero component. You can name it whatever you want. You can call it their secret identity.
Yeah. Me that, I was just.
You have a question? Yeah. No, you need to. So it's, you could put whatever you want. Right? So like, you could just say like, name. One thing to imagine about children is that whatever is inside of things, it's not that children. Right? So you don't have to use the children. You can use it. That's just a special key on the prop, or it just refers to the copy, whatever that is. So you know what that is.
Como si fuera que sea un children.
Yeah.
Main people since the-
Identity didn't work? Ah, yes, it's because you've got.
So how do you change just the, I think I don't know which one is, because I have this. So you know, but I don't know, just change the
That's
title.
just part of your.
No, it doesn't come here. That's what we're talking about. How are you going to change? Yeah.
On your actual LI.
You
You change that,
Oh, my goodness.
but you can pass it in as, it could be processed as secret ID, which means you would have all this here. Yeah. So if you wanted it that way, you can pass it in. And it's here.
Oh, this is like the UL.
And that's, a lot of times you'll do something like that because you're abstracting away from the actual HTML, right? All right, do some people have it done? Yeah? You ready to work through it up here? Got a few more questions. What?
The hover text
Who's getting you?
is trouble with, like, I can't figure out.
Let's see.
Deleted everything. I was trying to like figure out how to,
Oh,
and I don't.
I think I refreshed it.
Yes, so.
Okay. You're not far off. I mean, there's a couple things you need, right? So you have to pass in
In here.
an attribute. So we can name it whatever we want it to be. The hero there. Like it could be secret.
Do I have to do like the title or?
It doesn't have to, it could be any attribute. So you could do title. I'm gonna use something like equals, and then you can and then just whatever thing that's part here.
Oh, well that.
No, you have to do one more thing. There's one thing missing, which is up here in your hero, you need to refer to that property. So just like props.children, you like props.title, title is just props.title. That's secret.
Yeah, I was trying to play around with,
And that should work.
Oh.
Yeah.
What?
All right. Let's work through this up here now, collectively. You guys ready for that? Yes. All right. And I'll do some variants because I don't want people to get stuck on the way, like one way to think about that. So here's the first thing I'm going to do. I don't want all these separate functions. That was a pain in the butt, right? All right. So let's make one. It's called hero. And it's going to take some props. And I don't need these either because I'm not using them anymore. Let's get rid of all that. So if I assume right now I've got a hero component, it's going to take some props. Let's try and change out this Superman for our new hero. So I need to call our hero component. And there's a couple ways I could write this. I'll write it this way. You could write it, there's not a right or wrong here, but I'm going to write it and put some content into the body of it as the children. And I'm going to come up here. Let me get rid of this title right now because we don't have one yet. And I just want to render that children right here. So what I'll do is I'll escape my JavaScript using the curly braces to inline my JavaScript into my JSX, and I'll put my children. Let me get rid of these other ones. Just comment them out if this works. That will not work. So I'll just delete them anyways. Oh yeah, I don't have a hero list. So let me change this just a little bit. Da, 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 da. Function hero list. There's not much that needs to change on this. It's much simpler. I'll just return. Again, I'll use these curly braces because it makes stuff easier. Do some indenting here. So reasonable, and then close my function. And now I've got the very basic like Superman right here. Make sense so far? Okay, but what I'm missing is the secret identity part, right? And we know that we were assigning that to the title. So we're gonna have something for title. And we could do it like, we could just have it be the title here, right? Like we could say title. But I'm not gonna do that. And the reason I'm not gonna do that is I don't want to, we could, there's nothing wrong with that. But I'm trying to have my component, like when somebody calls that component, not be sort of telling the person what the HTML is that's going to happen behind the scenes, so that it could vary, so that we can change it without it feeling like we did something wrong. And that'll make sense if we play around with this a little more. I don't know if we'll have time tonight or not, but it makes sense over time. So instead, and we'll just pass in Clark Kent, which means that I need to get that property and assign it to my title. So I can use these curly braces on my title the same way I can when I get my children, and I'll just get my secret ID property and assign it to the title in this bit of JSX.
Okay, rewind. So
Yeah.
you're given it a key, and then you're going back to the, like, where all the modifications for the children are done. Please correct me, because I do want to use the right words, but you know what I'm saying. So then you go back to there, and that's where you call it.
That's where I reference it. Yes. Yes. This is where I referenced it to assign it to this title attribute, right? So I took the secret ID and just assigned it to the title.
I have a question.
Yes.
Why do you need to mention the ID?
Up here?
On the top? Yeah, up there.
So imagine this. Basically what's happening here, if we broke this down as JavaScript instead of as JSX, right? If we were trying to read this like it was JavaScript, you could imagine that, man, I really hate this whole thing being indented so much. There, I like that more. You could, let's act like this isn't here. This isn't how we're using it, right? So if I have this hero function and I just want to call it somewhere, I could do that. I could say hero, and what I'm passing into it is just one single property, but it's actually an object. So here I'm going to write an object, and that object has two keys on it. The first one is secret ID, Clark Kent, and the second one is children, which in this case is just the body of the one call we have, which is just the string Superman, but it could be something else, right? So this is the object getting passed into my hero function. So once you realize that and you say, ooh, I passed this object in, how can I reference this in there, this secret ID? How can I call it, right? If this wasn't JSX, right? If we're just writing plain old JavaScript, we could do that with something like this, right? Console.log props.secret ID. It's just using the key on this props object. And that's the same thing that we're doing right here. It's just a little more obfuscated or whatever, but it's basically doing the exact same thing. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So yeah, it can be easy to get hung up on the syntax being a little different, but it's just function calls. That's really what's happening is it's calling this hero function just like this, passing in an object, just like this object right here. And then we're just referencing those properties on it. So now we could go ahead and write this out for each one of these, right? Secret ID equals. Trying to remember what I had for all of my, right? But this is where you guys are going to see me say, wait a minute, I'm a lazy programmer. I feel like I'm writing this same thing out once again. How is this much different than the list item bit of code that I wrote originally, right? So I'm going to get lazy. This is where you begin to see like how you can leverage the fact that you're writing your JSX directly in JavaScript and you have all of the capabilities of JavaScript at your fingertips. You don't have to treat it like it's just HTML. So I'm going to go ahead and get lazy instead. I'm going to now create a like heroes. Let's create a heroes array. And in each one of these, I'm going to have a name and like a secret identity. I'm lazier. No matter what, right? It doesn't matter how I render this. I need this list. All right, so let's create this list item. Now let's do a name. Secret identity of. All right, let's see what else I had. It's not really a secret identity for her. All right, and then I'm going to actually take this hero function. I'm just going to minify this real fast. Take my hero function and move it down so we can see it all together. It'll be easier than having it separated by this list of heroes. So now we've got a nice array of heroes. I want to render this hero list. There's several different ways I could do this, but I am a good lazy programmer. So I'm going to got my UL here, and I'm going to do a little bit of JavaScript, just embed it right here. And if you guys, I don't know if you guys have worked with this yet, but there's something called, there's like for each or also map are both functions that exist on arrays. So I'm going to do a map across this array. And then what do I want to do for that? Well, then I have, this is where arrow functions are commonly used. I'll go ahead and be nice. I'll separate one out here instead and just write a function. But I may convert it over to an arrow function real fast in a moment. I'll just call it map hero. It takes a hero in, and what it's going to return is a hero with a secret ID equal to hero.secret ID. And then the body of this will be hero.name. And in hero, oops, I gotta close my curly brace right there, right? So I've got a very simple function. It just takes in a hero and then returns an element, right? So now when I call heroes.map, I can tell it what function I want, which is map hero. And we've got a problem.
You didn't tell it to return hero.name.
What?
You didn't tell it to return
No, I forgot to escape hero.name. because that's JavaScript. I have to escape it, yeah.
Okay.
And so I wouldn't have expected anybody to have broken it down that much, but I'm trying to show you how to think through it piece by piece, right? Like you probably, what I would expect is, you've got a list of the hero elements one by one, but I'm showing you what happens when you start mixing in the power of JavaScript and being able to mix that right in with your JSX syntax, right? So we've got all of these guys here. They've got their code names right there. And we've done it with a hero list and a hero component. Does this make sense? Yes, no?
Where are the objects?
What's that?
The objects that oh, inside that? Yeah. That whole thing. With the list of heroes, where is?
Oh, I hit it.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
I used what's known as code folding. So if you see these little arrows over here on the side, I don't know if you can see them on that projector. If you click those, it sort of folds that bit of code so that you don't, that's getting back to that concept of abstraction, right? Like, I don't want to think of those details. I've got an array of heroes and I don't need to look at them and have them cluttering my view. So I minified it down to that, and then I can just expand it back up. So also, if you look at the line numbers, you'll see that jump 1 to 23. That's an indication that there's some code hiding somewhere. Does that make sense? So much that you don't think that other people wouldn't be familiar with it. So I hope this is like, I hope there's some, you're starting to begin to see some of the power that you can get out of this, composing this stuff in these sorts of powerful ways. Let's see where we're at here. All right, I don't have much more to go through, and then I think I'll come back to this and I'll show a little bit more of what else we can do as well. But I wanted to talk about just a couple more concepts real fast. First one is React's one rule. Do you remember what the rule I talked about earlier for components was that you create yourself? Your component should all start with a capital letter, right? So there's really only, that's like, you should do that. I mean, I don't actually know how bad React's going to punish you if you don't. But React does have one rule that is important, that is like fundamental to the way that it works. And that's that props are read-only. So that props object that we passed in, you should never change the values of anything in that props object once it gets passed in. So don't change the values of any of them. Never modify the values in any way. And the reason is because that's sort of fundamental to the way that React works. So if you change any values in that props object, it's never going to notice that those changed, and it's never going to update your UI to reflect that.
Is that why components in the virtual one and can only pass the elements? Does that have any relation to it?
Not exactly. It's just like the rule of, like, I guess how React props work is you can't mutate them. The real underlying reason, not to get into too much detail, is basically because React renders your component once for props, and it won't pay attention to any changes to those props. So it can't, if you change those values, you may end up in a weird state with your component because it's not going to know to re-render. Now, we haven't been doing much re-rendering of our components yet. The closest we got was the example using the tick, where we were ticking up with the clock in the other class. But starting, it'll either be the next class or the one after, we'll get into working with state, where our components, we don't have to re-render using react.render every time, because in most React apps, you actually only call that once, like when you start up your app. And from there on, you're changing different portions of state inside of your app, but you can never mutate the props directly. Instead, you need to call your component again with the new props passed into it, is the way that you change anything like that. So then, really quick, I don't want to spend much time on this because we're definitely going to dig into it more. And I know that you guys just briefly mentioned it at the end of your last class, but this is introducing the concept of classes in JavaScript real fast. Again, I don't want you guys to get too focused on it, too worried about it. I just wanted to touch on the syntax real fast to start getting you thinking about it for the next class. So classes are just another way to create objects. In a lot of other programming languages, they're the only way to create objects. So if you're familiar with, I can't actually, I'm trying to think of another programming language that's, yeah, I know, but I'm trying to think of any that don't. Java, C#, Python, I think even Ruby, the only way to create an object is from a class. I can't think of another object-oriented language where you can create objects that aren't class-based. Maybe you can in Ruby, I'm not sure. But classes are, in most languages, the way to create objects. In JavaScript, they're just another way to create them. They're not the only way. And so you guys have seen that already. We've created object literals just on the fly without classes at all. But you can think of a class like a blueprint for creating objects of a specific type, right? This is like the canonical example. You've got a blueprint. If you follow the blueprint, you get an object of that type, right? If you follow the blueprint for a house, you get a house that looks like the blueprint. That's what a class is intended to do. So quick introduction to their syntax. Again, we're going to be going over this much more, so you guys don't need to get too focused on it today. But it just involves this class keyword here, and then the name of the class. And you can name it whatever you want, although convention is that you usually start class names with an uppercase letter, just like you're doing with React components. The only thing that's really special about a class outside of that class keyword is they have a built-in method called constructor. And that constructor method is what gets called when you new up an object from that class. So right here, we're calling new rectangle. That's creating a new rectangle object from this class, and it's calling this constructor. And that's the reason that we passed in these two parameters, because the constructor here has two parameters. It's like initialize in Ruby. Yes, it's this exact same thing. So again, I'm not going to spend too long on this because we'll go over this a lot more. But then to set some properties on your object, like the way that we've done like object literals is you just literally give it a property name. You can refer to them inside of this constructor using this or inside of any other methods defined here with this. So this creates just a width and a height property. And it also creates a getArea property, which is really just a method that returns the width and the height. So if we were to look at this real fast in an actual JavaScript environment, we can create rectangles like 3, 4. And if we looked at our rect object, we see it has these two properties that it's listing right there. And it also has the getArea ability attached to it that just returns what you got from that. So there's nothing too fancy. It's not dramatically different from the way that we've created objects so far. Now, the next bit is dramatically different. This is where you get into something new that I don't know if you guys have encountered or talked about at all. Oh, the constructor, right? So objects can extend behavior from other objects. And this is known as inheritance. I don't know if this has been talked about with this class at all, but object inheritance is really it's a complex concept. When we talk about it in more detail, and I don't know if we'll go into too much detail because you don't use it that much in React. But don't expect to fully understand it the first time you learn it or hear about it. It's pretty complex. But to give an example of how to do that in JavaScript, I've got, this is again one of these sort of canonical examples. If we create a square class, we can use this special syntax where we say it extends rectangle. So that's presuming we already have that rectangle class that we created in our environment. And now what we've done, we write a different constructor for our square class, which only takes in one number because a square, all the sides are the same. So it only needs one length. And what we do is we call super length. And this is, again, don't worry about all this too much. But let's go back to our rectangle that we had here, what that's doing is calling the constructor, this constructor, and passing in that length value for each one of these, and then assigning those to the width and the height values. And then we can call the get area with our square as well. So let's step over, look at that real fast. If we create our square, and let's create an instance of it, a new square, which has length of 5. Then if we look at our square, we'll see it has a width of 5 and a height of 5. Because it ultimately called down to that rectangle constructor, passing it those two values. And we can call square.getArea, and it uses that same computation. So that's sort of the canonical example. And we'll dig into these a lot more. Classes are new to JavaScript. They're not something that's been in it historically. They came about with ES6. So before that, you never had this method for creating objects. You created them using a whole bunch of other different syntaxes. But it has become pretty popular. And one of the biggest reasons it's become popular is every other object-oriented language uses classes as their way of creating objects. So people feel comfortable and familiar with them. And it's also heavily used in the React community for another way to create components, which have more capability. And we'll be looking at that. I don't know if we'll look at that in the next class, because I want to do more about components and component composition. So I think I'm going to try to do some more hands-on type stuff before we dig too much deeper. So anybody can step out, and then I might play around just for a minute. I'm going to go ahead and end the video too. Stop the broadcast so people don't have to wait any longer.